This week on Let's Talk About Mental Health, I'm talking about managing your feelings. So, let's get talking. This is Let's Talk About Mental Health, a weekly podcast about mental health and well-being, hosted by Jeremy Godwin. Let's talk about mental health, because the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. Hello and welcome to episode 28 of Let's Talk About Mental Health, the weekly podcast about improving your mental health and well-being. I'm Jeremy Godwin. Thank you for joining me. I've been talking for a while here on Let's Talk About Mental Health about the fact that the only things that you can actually control are your words, your actions, and your feelings. And so this week, I'm talking about learning how to manage your feelings, even when it might seem completely and utterly impossible. So let's talk. So much of what we experience in this world is based around what we think and what we feel. And when you're dealing with mental health challenges like anxiety or depression, it can be really difficult and even overwhelming to deal with the sheer weight of everything that goes on in our minds. Now, you've probably heard the expression, feelings aren't facts, and it's a common one to be discussed in terms of mental health, because so much of what goes on inside of our heads can seem real, but it's not. What we think and what we feel can sometimes be completely unrelated to reality, and instead, it can be driven by our fears and our insecurities. So we can choose to let go of thoughts and feelings that aren't good for us. With time and effort, we can learn to manage our feelings and improve our mental health and well-being, which is what I'm going to be discussing this week. So let's start with some definitions, and specifically, what are feelings? Feelings are all of the stuff that's going on just underneath the surface for each of us. It's our emotions. Only we can perceive what we're feeling. What the world gets to see are our behaviours, and that manifests through our words and our actions. Now, what drives our behaviour is our feelings and our intentions, that stuff going on under the surface. And these, in turn, are often created by our thoughts, and those thoughts are then driven by our needs and whether or not our needs are being met or not met in any given situation. Thoughts are ideas, opinions, and beliefs that form in your mind. They're often subconscious, and they can either pop into your head out of nowhere, or they can form as the result of paying attention to something. Thoughts can be fact-based, or they may have absolutely no basis in fact whatsoever. Regardless, just like feelings, thoughts are not facts. They are reactions. They're reactions that are driven by a whole range of factors, such as, like I said before, whether or not our needs are being met. Our feelings can also come out of nowhere, just as much as they can be a response to what we're thinking and what's going on around us. Now, we each have thousands of different thoughts and feelings every day, many of which can seem to just pop into our head out of nowhere, but they are being driven by a whole bunch of stuff, including how you're feeling at any given time. So, for example, if you're feeling negative, we all know that it's often then much easier to focus on negative thoughts than it is if you're in a positive frame of mind. And in that way, I think it demonstrates the whole positivity breeds positivity thing that I talk about a lot in this podcast. Because when you're feeling positive and you're thinking positively, it becomes much easier to find more things to be positive about. Many of our thoughts and feelings are related to our brain trying to make sense of everything going on in the world around us, and also trying to understand how and where we fit in, combined with our values and our beliefs. Now, let's be realistic. You have pretty much zero control over when and how your thoughts and feelings manifest, which might sound like a really funny thing to say in a podcast episode about managing your feelings, but hear me out. Trying to control your thoughts or stop particular thoughts happening is, I think we all know, it's like trying to wrestle cats. It's virtually impossible, and you're probably going to end up covered in scars for your efforts. What is possible, however, is to take control of what you do with your feelings and thoughts, and that's my focus for today. There's a great quote by American author Dan Millman, which I think sums it up perfectly, and it is, "You don't have to control your thoughts, you just have to stop letting them control you." The great thing is that thoughts and feelings aren't permanent, and so if you're struggling with negative emotions, then know that they cannot possibly last forever. We have the opportunity to take control of them, and so, with enough time and practice, You can develop strategies to push negative feelings aside, or at least handle them differently and be more objective about them. When you allow your thoughts and feelings to control you, you become a slave to them. And that can make it really difficult to make any kind of positive progress because you'll be bogged down by what's going on inside your head. Also, letting negative feelings take over can have adverse effects on your life, such as letting fear hold you back from trying something new, or when we regularly say or do things out of anger, which can then cause further consequences for us later. When it comes to feelings, our goal should be ideally to experience them without letting them control us and without getting stuck in them. So let's talk through feelings a bit more and then get into a discussion about how you actually do that, how you control them. So we all feel different things based on what's going on internally as well as externally. So either in the world that we directly inhabit, like our home, our family, and our workplace, or in the greater world around us. That could be your street, your city, your state, your country, or even the planet as a whole. And I think there's just as much to be learned from negative emotions, like fear, anger, and insecurity, as there is for us to learn from more positive emotions, like contentment, excitement, and joy. And when it comes to feelings, our society seems to be intent on categorizing them as either good or bad. And let's be honest here, most of that's tied into marketing and sales of some sort, because we're often being sold something and then told that it will either stop bad feelings or increase good feelings. However, there isn't really a good or a bad feeling. They're just feelings, and they're just reactions to what's going on internally and externally. When we label things as good or bad, we're putting a judgment on them, and therefore on ourselves. And I often say in this podcast that you need to feel what you need to feel, and that's true in pretty much every situation that you'll find yourself in. So instead of judging, the challenge is to work out why we're feeling what we're feeling, and then to identify the appropriate way to act on those feelings. There's a great quote by the American television personality Mr. Rogers that I think sums it up, and it is, "There's no should or should not when it comes to having feelings. They're part of who we are, and their origins are beyond our control. When we can believe that, we may find it easier to make constructive choices about what to do with those feelings." So let me just repeat that last bit. Make constructive choices about what to do with those feelings. Because I think that's what all of this comes down to. Choosing to respond constructively to our feelings. You'll never be able to stop specific feelings arising, like fear or anger or sadness, but it's what you do with those feelings that matters, because that is what determines what happens next. Also, I think a lot of the time we're socially conditioned to have this never-ending focus on the pursuit of happiness. But you don't have to be happy all the time in order to have your feelings under control, or even to have a great life. In fact, I don't believe it's possible for any of us to be happy 100% of the time, because there's always going to be so much going on in our lives that's way outside of our control. And so it's an impossible goal to chase, and it sets us up for failure. I've talked before about the idea of pursuing greater satisfaction with your life rather than this goal of constantly chasing happiness. Satisfaction with who you are, what you have, and what you contribute to the world is much more likely to make you feel positive than any pursuit of happiness, because happiness is often fleeting. This is a topic that I'll discuss in an episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health at some point over the next few months. But coming back to feelings, feeling is what makes us human. It's proof of life. Feelings can be messy and complicated, and they can pull us in all different directions and make it hard to know which way is up. But the challenge is to observe our feelings without letting them control us. There's a great article I found online called How to Control Your Emotions So Your Emotions Don't Control You. It's from Inc., and I'll include the link in the transcript. Let me just quote this paragraph from that article. "Managing your emotions isn't the same as suppressing them. Ignoring your sadness or pretending you don't feel pain won't make those emotions go away. In fact, unaddressed emotional wounds are likely to get worse over time. And there's a good chance suppressing your feelings will cause you to turn to unhealthy coping skills. It's important to acknowledge your feelings while also recognizing that your emotions don't have to control you. If you wake up on the wrong side of the bed, you can take control of your mood and turn your day around. If you are angry, you can choose to calm yourself down." And again, the link for that article is in the transcript. There's a few really important points, and that's why I included that paragraph. And the main one is that managing your emotions isn't about suppressing them. It's actually about objectively addressing them and integrating them into your life. So enabling your logical, rational side and your emotional side to work together in harmony. And that makes you more authentically you in everything that you do. I think the challenge for each of us is to be aware of how our feelings are manifesting in terms of our words and our actions, and to know the difference between constructive versus destructive feelings, so that we can minimize any destructive patterns of behavior. Managing your feelings means being able to modulate them. Why does that matter? Because if you can modify your feelings to suit the situation, then you have a greater chance of achieving positive outcomes. Think about being in an argument with someone. If you allow anger to take over, then you'll quite likely end up in a screaming match. Whereas if you can pause and refocus to instead look for solutions, then you'll be much more likely to engage with the other person in a calm and rational manner, and that can lead to more positive outcomes. For another example, think about feeling scared of giving something a try. If you let that feeling of fear take over, then you're very unlikely to take any action. Whereas if you work through your fear so you can understand where it's coming from and then harness that, you're much better equipped to give things a go and then see what happens from there. The choice, as with everything, is always yours. So how do you choose to control your feelings? Well, let's get into the how-to part of this week's episode. Okay, let's start with a 4-step model called PATH, P-A-T-H, which I originally sourced from an article called Ways to Manage Emotions by Mental Health America. The link is in the transcript, and the article includes that acronym, but I've changed it slightly and expanded on the steps a bit further. So in this context, PATH stands for pause, acknowledge, think, and how. Let me explain what those 4 steps mean. First, pause. So instead of immediately reacting to your feelings, pause and reflect. Now, you might find it useful to count to 10 or 20 or 100, depending on how strongly you're feeling. And what that does is it gives your initial instinctive reaction some time to simmer down. And that will allow your logical and rational mind to kick in. Now, that can take a few seconds, especially when we're in a confronting situation, because our fight, flight, or freeze response often takes over in the first few seconds. So, pause. Next, acknowledge what you're feeling. So rather than just going with the initial feeling, once you've paused for a few seconds, take a moment to identify what it is that you're actually feeling. So for example, are you angry at someone, or have their words and actions hurt your feelings? Often we just respond to the initial emotion, and the challenge is to identify what you're actually feeling and label it objectively. Don't focus on whether it's right or wrong or try to assign blame. It's just about acknowledging what you're feeling, observing it, and labeling it. So then the third step is think. Think about why. Once you're clear on what you're feeling, think in more detail about why you're feeling that way. Are you actually angry, or is the anger a symptom of feeling that you're not being heard on a regular basis? Often our feelings are being driven by much deeper emotions, which are tied to whether or not our needs are being met. So the challenge is to consider what's going on in terms of our needs, to understand why you might be feeling what you're feeling. And then the final step is how. How will you respond? So once you understand the reasons why you're feeling whatever you're feeling, think about how you want to respond. Now, whether it's something going on inside you or it's external, how you respond will shape what happens next. So if you were arguing with someone and you're feeling angry, then reacting by shouting will potentially lead to the argument escalating. Whereas if you pause, reflect, and consider why you're really feeling angry, then you'll be much better equipped to respond in a calm and rational manner. Or at the very least, remove yourself from the situation until you're able to be calm and rational. The overarching message here is that just reacting to your feelings means that they will control you. Whereas taking the time to process whatever you're feeling so that you can understand it will enable you to respond much more thoughtfully. And that will likely lead to better outcomes that are far less weighed down by pure emotion. Keep in mind throughout all of this that you can only control your own words and actions and feelings. You can never control another person. No amount of huffing or puffing or blowing down of houses will ever make another person act the way that you want them to. So when you're dealing with other people, focus on you. Focus on being calm and rational. And remember that old saying, you attract more flies with honey than with vinegar. In other words, you're much more likely to end up with a positive outcome by being nice than you would if you're unpleasant. And so then, beyond that advice for using the path approach, pause, acknowledge, think, and how, there are lots of things that you can do to be proactive about managing your feelings. Because, as always, prevention is better than cure. So rather than waiting until you're in a challenging situation and having to deal with your emotions then, there are lots of things that you can do every day that make it easier to manage your feelings if and when you're then dealing with difficult times. So some of those things are talking about your feelings. Now, this is why therapy and counselling are so useful, because they allow you the time and space to work through your feelings in a supportive and non-judgmental environment. And the more you talk about things, the easier it is to figure out what's really going on inside you, so that you can then deal with the root cause rather than just the symptom. Yep, possibly my favourite analogy in the whole wide world. So speaking of talking about your feelings is not a sign of weakness. In fact, it is a sign of bravery, because it's a huge part of taking charge of your well-being and being proactive about your mental health and your overall health. If you keep things bottled up and you don't deal with them, they may escalate, and before you know it, you're up the creek without a paddle. So talk about what's going on and get support where you need it. Another piece of advice is to have daily practices that help you to get in touch with your feelings. I have talked many, many times in this podcast about the value of daily gratitude practice, where you spend a few minutes quietly reflecting on 5 to 10 things that you're grateful for each day. And it's something that I do every morning without fail as a way to start my day off proactively looking for the good. And I encourage you to look at something like that. Maybe also have a few minutes of nightly reflection time where you gently and non-judgmentally reflect on the day and think about what were 2 or 3 things that you're grateful for from the day. Also, potentially, what might be 1 or 2 things that maybe didn't go so well. And instead of focusing on the bit that didn't go so well, instead focus on what can I learn from this? So in other words, what might you do differently next time for a different outcome? Now, the important part here is not to dwell on negativity or blame, because what's done is done and it cannot be changed, but instead to learn what you need to learn. If you're interested in more about reflection, have a listen to episode 12, which is, funnily enough, about reflection, and I go into that in a lot more detail. Or if you are someone who finds yourself overthinking about these sort of things, I did episode 4 about overthinking, so that dreaded subject. So feel free to jump over and have a listen to that one, or you can read the transcripts on the website. Another daily practice that's really worthwhile is journaling. So we're not talking about your, 12-year-old's diary here. You don't need to keep a detailed diary unless that's what feels right to you. But just jotting down a few notes about the day can help you to process them and get them out of your head. And often, once things are on paper, they take on a different life and a different feeling than if they're just stuck in your head. I'm one of those people who needs to get things out in order to let them go. So when it comes to being able to do that, journaling can be a really good tool for that. There's a really short article by the University of Rochester called Journaling for Mental Health, and I'll include the link to that in the transcript if you're interested, or you can just Google it to find the information. But find daily practices like that that help you to get things out and process through them. Now, speaking of daily practices, mindfulness is a practice that I talk about a lot in Let's Talk About Mental Health, and I'm sure you've read 50,000 things about it on the internet. It doesn't have to be some kind of elaborate and time-consuming practice. I think we over-engineer a lot of stuff, and realistically, mindfulness, at least to me, simply means taking the time to slow down and to be more aware of our surroundings, as well as what's going on inside of us. My absolute favorite way to practice mindfulness is to sit outside and watch the clouds for a few minutes. Or I like to sit outside and stare up at the sky and just enjoy the immensity of the stars. Mindfulness really is just about greater awareness of both yourself and the world around you. And it's something that you can do anywhere and for any length of time. You can mindfully ride the tram, or you can mindfully drive your car, or you can mindfully eat a meal and be aware of every single sensation, everything going on. And the more that you practice it, the easier it becomes over time to mindfully be aware of your feelings as they're emerging. And I find that it often helps me then to be able to label what I'm feeling, and that helps push me into that path approach of pause, acknowledge, think, and how. Okay, more broadly than that is something I talk about a lot again, looking after your mental, physical, and spiritual health. I say this a lot, and that's because everything is connected. And when I talk about spirituality, I'm not referring to religion, but if that's what feels right to you, then fantastic. But rather what I'm talking about is having some sort of sense of there being more to life than just you. Spirituality is highly personal, but at its core, it is about being more than just an individual. Whether that's feeling a sense of connectedness with your fellow humans, with the universe, or being a Jedi connected with the Force, looking beyond just your own wants and needs will hopefully help you to make life decisions that aren't purely focused on yourself. My next point is around choosing your mindset. So you can choose to focus on solutions rather than problems. The reality is that when you look for problems, you will find them. So why not choose to look for solutions instead? Now, I've known many people in my life, as I'm sure you have, who will happily complain about anything and everything, but when you ask them what ideas they've had for rectifying their problems, they look at you like you've got three heads. Now, misery is a choice. Because if we choose to get caught up in all the things that are wrong, then that's all that we will see. Let me say that I totally respect that we all go through challenging times and situations, especially when we're dealing with mental health issues, and I know about living with depression and anxiety firsthand. But you can still choose to look for solutions and to be optimistic about the potential for things to improve. And that feels way better than just throwing your hands up and admitting defeat. You might find that really difficult to do, especially if you're struggling. And if that's the case, my next suggestion is one that I talk about 65,000 times an episode: get support. Now, I covered it before with the talking about your feelings thing, but let me say, you never have to go through anything alone. You can always talk to a counselor or a therapist. You can chat with your doctor. You can get support from an understanding and non-judgmental friend or family member. You can join a support group. There are so many different support options available to you. And the main thing is that you are never alone. So get support, because many hands make light work. With all of that in mind, when it comes to feelings, what it all boils down to is this. Your thoughts and feelings aren't real. They're simply manifestations of how you perceive yourself and the world around you. If we ever find ourselves feeling destructive emotions or thinking negative thoughts, we have the opportunity to change our reality by changing how we feel. It can be a real challenge to do that, especially when we're struggling with issues like anxiety or depression, but it is entirely possible to choose our mindset and to choose what we do with our thoughts and our feelings. If you let your emotions control you, then they will control you. However, if you choose to mindfully observe them and seek to understand what they're really trying to tell you about your needs, then with time and effort, you'll be able to let go of the negative and focus on the positive. And where focus goes, energy flows. Everything in life is a choice, so make the choice to respond to your feelings constructively in order to create a better reality for yourself. To finish up, let me take a moment to share a quote about this week's topic that I'd like to encourage you to reflect on and consider what it means to you. This week's quote is by the Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius, and it is, "Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth." Let me repeat that. Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. Alright, that's it for this week's episode. Next week, I'll be talking about habits. I'll be discussing the role of habits in good mental health and well-being, and how you can change your habits over time. I hope you'll join me for that episode, which will be released on Monday morning in Australia and New Zealand, Sunday evening in the UK and Ireland, and Sunday afternoon in the US and Canada. In the meantime, you can find past episodes and additional content at the website, which is letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. That's letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. You can also find Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest at LTA Mental Health. That's at LTA Mental Health. Thank you very much for joining me today. Look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness in the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time.